What is the worst experience you have ever had with your neighbors? All right, let's see. She told me my dad passed of incurable brain cancer because I didn't speak the tongue of Jesus, lay hands on him, and pray. Before I knew how crazy she was, we let our son go to her house to play with her daughter. And when we came to pick him up, they were gone. It turns out she had driven them to her parents' house, like 40 minutes away, without our permission. She gave us a bag of hand-me-downs for our daughter with a sharp object in the bottom. There's so much more incidents, like how much time do you all have? Okay, here it goes, though the worst is above. It started out that we just thought she was a free-spirited, hippy-dippy Scandinavian lady with alternative parenting ideas. But we gradually learned that she was just a horrible person. The first red flag was that I picked up my 4-year-old son after a short visit playing with her younger girl, and she said they were playing beach most of the time. I told her he wasn't allowed to be undressed anymore, but wasn't mad because I knew things were less uptight in Norway where she was from. I talked to my son about it. Her older daughter was always misbehaving. Her first time over to our house, she smeared chapstick all over an entire wall. She was like 6, plenty old enough to know better. Another time, she sneaked into our house while I was outside playing with my kids and started eating some brownies I had just made. I mean, she tore a hole right smack in the middle of the plastic wrap over the dish and scooped out handfuls of brownies. She would pole dance on the tree out front singing Shake Yo Moneymaker. She was 6 years old, maybe 7. She had birthday parties for her children, which we were invited to and brought gifts to, and then we found out their real birthdays were later in the year, when we were invited again, and I tried to decline. The lady tried to explain that she celebrated half birthdays. I explained to her that I didn't. After the worst incident I mentioned earlier, my children were not allowed to play at their house anymore, and we still all ran into each other walking to school. She would tell me how she saw real demons walking around disguised as people. She told me that God told her that I was really close to seeing the light and becoming Christian. It was during this time that someone called CPS on her and she accused me of it. It wasn't me, but maybe it should have been. The dad was around and was surprisingly a super nice, down-to-earth guy with a good sense of humor. He was actually the one who was at home when we tried to pick up my sons and told us she had taken them. He was mortified that she hadn't cleared it with us and that we didn't know anything about it. He was black and she was white. She made a few unnecessary comments at one of the birthday parties that made me uncomfortable, super serious about how black people are always late. We finally moved, but she caught up with me one day to give me the bag of used clothes for my daughter. I hurt my finger on the sharp object in the bag, but luckily not very badly. That was the last I saw of her. Story 2. I lived above a guy in a really old fourplex, and I guess the wood floors squeaked really loudly when I walked around. It's not like I was stomping around either, but the dude would constantly come upstairs and bang on my door and yell at me to stop moving around. I felt bad for him in the beginning because he seemed genuinely frustrated, but he didn't seem to understand or believe that I wasn't slamming my feet on my floor or his ceiling. I called my landlord several times asking if he had a solution. I couldn't move because I was locked into my lease, but my landlord was just like, buy a lot of rugs. It got to the point that I couldn't take the constant yelling and I was literally either tiptoeing around or hopping from my couch to my chair in order to get out of my living room so that he wouldn't be standing at my door yelling at me. Finally, I went downstairs one day and asked if we could talk about the situation because I felt like maybe if I looked him in the eye when he was calm and explained that I wasn't doing it on purpose, and that there was literally nothing more I could do, I had already bought area rugs, he would maybe understand. So I went downstairs and explained very nicely and he seemed to be listening. And then he said, I'm about to the point that if it happens again, I'm going to show up at your door. And then he just stared at me. I basically ran out of there, called my landlord and said that I was more or less being threatened, and a month later the guy moved out. And then, as soon as I could, I did too. Super crappy situation. Hold up. Buy a lot of rugs? That's the solution? Okay, if I'm supposed to do that, I expect my landlord to pay me back for it. Buy a lot of rugs, come on. Story 3. I had this one downstairs neighbor who lacked any respect for the fact that our building wasn't soundly insulated. He would listen to loud music mostly through the day and sometimes late at night. I'm a patient person. I try to ask them to be careful or sometimes banged on the floor when I just wanted to sleep. This lasted for months, but nothing had been done with the landlord. One day, though, I think he discovered that he really loved Gnarls Barkley is Crazy, and he decided it was appropriate to play it a half dozen times in the course of an hour, and I just had it. I really blew it. So, being a karaoke jockey and having my equipment on hand, I decided to show him what loud was. I connected my speakers to my computer through my console, then I went hunting for the absolute worst karaoke cover of that same song. I remember vividly that it was this creepy fat basement dweller in his late 40s dedicating the cover to a random girl on the internet, and it was horribly off tune. The voice was this annoying falsetto. So I played it. With the speakers flat on the floor, he'd get the full brunt of it. I played it 3 times in a row, loud enough that he would definitely suffer the consequences of his lack of respect. And wouldn't you know it, he never played that song again, and he started being much more conservative in his volume levels. He left that summer, and I never heard Crazy again from his collection. I wonder why. Story 4. I moved into a brand new house. I noticed an old toilet, garbage, and a broken down hot tub in the neighbor's front yard. Okay. I made cookies for all the neighbors and went over to introduce ourselves. He laughed and slammed the door in our faces. Okay. I was out landscaping in our new yard with my husband and laying some bricks. My husband is on his knees, making sure they are all level while I stand and hand him the bricks. The neighbor walks by and yells, "Well, I can see who wears the pants." Husband and I look at each other, perplexed. Okay. Get a puppy. Our other neighbor lets us know she witnessed the neighbor's grown son throwing cigs over the fence at her puppy when he was in the backyard. We found about 50 cigarette butts in our yard. We do not smoke. Then she also had to call the police because his other son broke the lights in her garage and dirtied up her welcome mat, all captured by her home video system. About 6 months later, I got a complaint for dog barking with a $500 fine. It was ridiculous. Our dog never barked unless someone walked by or came to the door. We had letters from all 16 surrounding neighbors attesting that our dog never barked, what great neighbors we were, and how crazy the complainant was. The letters were not admissible since there were 2 pathological adult sons and the neighbor's word against ours, 2 sane working adults. We lost and had to pay. We sold the house and moved shortly afterward. Story 5. It wasn't to do with me but my parents before they had children. When buying the first house, our current family home, they arrived on their motorbikes to view the house. After deciding on buying it, they greeted the neighbors. The neighbors expressed how thankful they were that the biker couple didn't buy the house, then proceeded to rant about their dislike towards bikers, not knowing my parents were the biker couple. As you can imagine, it didn't go down too well when the pricks noticed the bikes. Anyway, to the more interesting bit. A few weeks and months after their initial chat with the neighbors, my parents were sitting in the living room minding their own business when they heard an explosion. They ran outside to find both of their bikes on fire. They called the fire brigade, which put out the fire. One of the firemen approached my mom and pointed out that there were matches lying around and this was more than likely arson. My mom didn't pursue it with the police for God knows what reason, but while in her fit of rage, she told my dad, "Whoever did this is going to hurt their right leg." Coincidence or not, a week later, the one neighbor came home with his right leg in a cast. Story 6. My first apartment had a creepy old man who lived on the basement floor and this equally creepy kid in his early 30s on the top floor. Both of them regularly sat out on the porch entrance at varying times of the day and would catch me whenever I came home. I lied to the old man, we'll call him George, about my name in a moment of panic, and when he found out that wasn't my name, he started getting more aggressive and greeting me with my real name to show me how I'd done him wrong. He would circle the building when he realized I'd started using the back exit and sat on the back steps. I told my landlord twice and all they did was tell him not to talk to me, which made matters worse because he was still doing everything he was previously doing but with vengeance. He ended up stealing the wreath off my door because nobody else had one on their door and throwing it in the trash. At this point, I no longer cared about causing my landlord grief and asked them to pull up video footage. It turns out he'd been coming upstairs several times to see me when I left for work and would stand in front of my door. He ended up getting evicted. This was all happening while the kid on the top floor was still there. It was weird, but I didn't pay him much mind. After the whole George thing, I wanted to be on good terms with the other tenants, so I started saying hello when I came through the entrance or in the hallways. Bad call. Such a bad call. He started going around telling the other dudes that lived upstairs that he could do that girl down in C5, and how I wouldn't waste time on him. Whatever, I stopped saying hi to him. About 2 days later, I went to take my trash out and passed my window that was facing the alleyway. This dude was pressed up against my window, sliding his face around the glass, trying to see me. He saw me and tried to play it off, but the situation was already ruined for him. I called the cops. It turns out he'd been pegged for other crimes before on 2 other charges. He was evicted. Story 7. Okay, so I live in Brooklyn, New York. I recently got my own apartment in Greenpoint. I have a pretty great job in Midtown Manhattan that offers a lot of overtime, so I have crazy hours and I commute to work. So when I leave work late, usually around 11:45 every night, I catch the late trains and it takes me anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour to get home. Anyways, when I get home around 12:30 a.m., I'm exhausted and I just kick my shoes off and throw them and my duffel bag wherever they land, usually on the floor right by my apartment entrance. So when I first moved into my apartment, I always heard banging from the neighbor downstairs. I never thought anything of it. I was always like, is this person serious? They're working on their apartment at 1 o'clock in the morning? It wasn't until maybe 3 weeks ago that I realized that he or she was getting upset about the banging that I was doing over their heads. I guess our apartments are set up differently and their bedroom is directly under my living room. I've become more conscious of the noise I make when getting home and started gracefully taking my shoes off and placing my belongings on the couch. Regardless, the person who lives down there has never actually come up to my apartment to address the issue. But I find it hilarious because I just picture them laying in bed, cuddled up with a broomstick or something similar, and just waiting for the slightest pin drop to jump on top of their bed and start poking their ceiling. Now, before we jump into the next neighbor from hell story, make sure to hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more ridiculous next door incidents. Story 8. 2 houses over, we were good acquaintances, probably almost friends. The relationship had been going downhill pretty steadily for a while. I worked for the guy for a little bit. Last time this came up, I talked about how he stood me up and never answered his phone or door when agreeing to help me move my couch onto a trailer. So I have another example. He was my boss at the time this happened. I noticed he's really big on using people's stuff when they aren't around. He used a guy's garage and table saws and woodworking tools when he was gone. I told him multiple times, at least 5 times, hey, I'm cool with you borrowing my stuff, but just make sure you ask. I also don't like unscheduled visits, call or text if you want to stop over, just to let him know where I stand if he wants to borrow some more tools from me or whatever. I had let him borrow a 17mm impact socket from me. 2 weeks go by and assume he's probably lost it. Whatever, I won't agree to lend it out again. Well, after another few days, he says, hey, you weren't home, so I returned the socket and borrowed another. Yes, he hopped over my fence midday while I was gone, opened my garage door, returned the socket he borrowed, very scratched and marred up, and helped himself to some of my other tools. He tells me all this a week after it happens, out of the blue, as if it were no big deal. That was a breaking point after dealing with other crap from him. I told him to stay away from me, my house, my family, and my property. Story 9. I was in a car accident when I was young, maybe 8 years old. I had 2 sisters, one younger and one older, in the back seat with me, and in the front were our babysitters who were and are very close family friends. We went off a curb on our very own road that was notorious for accidents. My brother would total his car slamming into a telephone pole in the same corner a few years later. Anyhow, we slid off and the car flipped several times. It was the middle of winter in northern Vermont. We had tons of snow and it was madly cold out. We were all okay as it was a low-speed accident, but the Jetta doors had crunched in, and the only way we could try to get out was by kicking the cracked windshield out. While our babysitters did their best, we couldn't get out. By this time, the person whose lawn we had rolled onto came down. He was very nice, but he couldn't get to us either. He told us he would go get his parents, who lived just up the road, to help. He returns with his parents. My babysitters' faces are a mixture of disbelief and concern. The context here would be that my babysitters are black. This guy's parents were their next-door neighbors who were extremely prejudiced. They would shoot in the air and in the general direction of the family's home and shout about America on basically every even remotely patriotic holiday. It came to a head one year when they shot through 2 layers of the fence our babysitter's father had installed out of worry for his many kids, and us because we basically lived there on the 4th of July, and were finally warned by the local police. Now, while analyzing our situation, the faces on the parents of the guy were a mixture of disgust and amusement. To this day, I'll remember them saying, "We aren't lifting a damn finger for these N-words," and they turned chuckling to themselves and left. The guy was embarrassed and he apologized on behalf of his parents. A few minutes later, a fire truck arrives because nothing ever happened, so why not? They break open the doors and help us out. I was freezing and confused, as were my sisters. That act has always stuck with me as totally abominable. I sincerely hope those two meet a crappy end. You and I both, OP. Hopefully, those two do meet a crappy end if they haven't already, or at least find themselves in the same situation and people just look at them and be like, nah, I'm out of here. I ain't helping you two. Story 10. My neighbors sprayed our hedge between our houses with something that ruined it, which we planted there next to her cyclone fence so we wouldn't have to look at her. Everything we've planted there wilts, and they always start wilting from her side. She's super nosy and is always watching out the window, which is why we plant things there. She also moved her in-ground sprinklers onto what I think is our property, touching our driveway, and set them to go off in the middle of the night when our cars are parked there. She refuses to set them to go off while we're at work because it interrupts her yard work time. The water spots on our cars are irrigation water and leave huge white amoeba-shaped marks down one side of her car. I paid someone $250 last year to use acid to remove them, and they were still faintly there. She actually had the nerve to suggest our son park his car there because the color of his car won't show the water spots as bad. Her husband walks up and down the backyard fence and whistles at our dog to make her bark. Then the wife complains to us about our dog barking. Our dogs are inside dogs, never outside for more than a few minutes at a time. They're not out there all day barking. When we have a family member house sit, the neighbor complains about the number of cars in our driveway and parked in front of our house. She says she doesn't like looking at a used car lot. She's a real peach, ain't she? Story 11. They insisted that we pay to have a gate installed between our backyard fences so that they may use our above-ground pool as they please, preferably when they invite friends over. When we denied, they threw a hissy fit and found an excuse to punish us. You see, the pool was going through some expensive issues with leakage into the yard. They threatened to call the Fine Happy HOA because the water was barely leaking into their yard, which they rarely used, and their dog was getting sick from drinking the water. It wasn't. Not wanting to deal with the BS and also wanting to clean our own backyard of the pond that began housing frogs, my father spent his birthday day off from work in the Texas heat digging a trench and installing a pipe so the water could drain. The neighbors came outside and harassed Dad the entire time he was digging the trench, telling him it would have been just easier to install the gate. It would have been easier to install a shovel into your frontal lobe, profligates. Story 12. When I moved into my house, I made an effort to meet all of my neighbors. Instead of being a creep and knocking on doors, over a few months I just waited until I saw someone outside and casually walked over to introduce myself. Well, one night, an African-American neighbor of mine was having a big, loud party, and I walked over to say hi around 8 p.m. It was a birthday party for one of his grandkids, but there were folks all out in the yard, so I thought it was okay to say hi. I said, hey, I'm X. I moved into this street a few doors down a couple of months ago. I was just stopping over to introduce myself. Do you look like the color that's supposed to be in this yard? I apologized and I went home. He died of a heart attack a couple of years later, probably from being such a hateful person. It super sucks to hear stories like this. I guess racism works both ways around. Like, why can't we all just get along? We're all the same color on the inside, bleeding red. Story 13. The family that lived across the street from my family was very interesting. First, about 3 generations of the family lived in that house. This usually wouldn't be a problem at all, but they had 6 cars that took up most of the road. The little kids, who I'm pretty sure, looking back, weren't allowed inside on summer days, would constantly set off one of the car's alarms, and it would take forever for one of the adults to come outside and turn it off. Second, the youngest boy in the family liked creeping on my little sister, who was his age. My parents freaked out and banned us from any interaction with him. Third, my mom says that one time she saw the dad of the family roughing up his teenage son on the front porch. This was an upper-class, stereotypically suburban neighborhood out in the middle of nowhere. How in the world can you rough up your kid outside in the middle of the day and none of the nosy people living there call the cops? I have no clue. Finally, one time while barbecuing, the grandpa accidentally knocked the grill over and somehow managed to set his entire yard on fire. He tried to put it out with a mini hose. My other neighbor had to call the fire department because he didn't own a cell phone. Alright, because of these stories, I learned to appreciate how quiet my next door neighbor is. Are you curious about the reason behind those bizarre encounters? Feel free to dive deeper into the minds of pesky neighbors in our next video. How did the crazy neighbor become the crazy neighbor? Story 1 is completely unexpected. I'll see you there, and thank you for watching this one.